Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're looking at one of the more peculiar parts of European military history, an army regiment prized not for its courage, its strategy, or even its willingness to fight, but for the simple fact that its members were unusually tall. This is the history of the Potsdam Giants. Before we march into that story, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. Military history is full of strange experiments, but few are stranger than an army created not for skill, loyalty, or courage, but for height. These were the Potsdam Giants, known in German as the Lange Kerls, literally the Long Fellows, a nickname that captured the mixture of awe and ridicule they inspired. In a time when most men stood little more than 5.5 feet tall, this regiment was composed of towering figures who stretched 6 feet or more, some even beyond 7. They were not gathered to win battles or to terrify enemies in the field. They were assembled to satisfy the peculiar tastes of a Prussian king who took greater pleasure in watching tall men march past him than in hearing about victories. If the regiment of giants seems like the product of pure madness, it is worth noting that its earliest roots were, at least in appearance, more ordinary. Before there was an obsession with height, there was a far more conventional idea that a ruler should surround himself with a corps of grenadiers, men chosen for their strength, loyalty, and discipline. In 1675, Prince Frederick of Brandenburg, who would later crown himself King Frederick I of Prussia, began assembling such a body. These were to be the best soldiers available, a personal guard that could represent both the security of his person and the dignity of his rising state. There was nothing particularly unusual about this at first. Most European rulers liked to keep an elite regiment nearby, if only to impress their subjects and visiting ambassadors. Grenadiers, by their nature, already leaned toward the tall side. They were the shock troops of the late 17th century, men tasked with carrying heavy grenades and charging into enemy lines where steadier soldiers might hesitate. Their very role demanded strength and stamina, and height often went hand in hand with those qualities. When Frederick began gathering his grenadiers, he naturally attracted men who looked imposing. In an age when the average farmer or craftsman was significantly shorter than his modern counterpart, even a man of 6 feet would have towered above a crowd. These grenadiers stood out, and they looked magnificent in formation. The pageantry of soldiers mattered almost as much as their effectiveness. Europe in the late 17th century was a stage on which rulers competed not only in warfare, but in appearances. Courts were judged by their splendour, ceremonies by their grandeur, and armies by their ability to awe both friend and foe. Frederick of Brandenburg, ambitious and eager to elevate his principality's standing, recognised the usefulness of soldiers who were not merely capable, but visually impressive. To line the streets of Berlin with a tall, uniformed corps was to broadcast strength, wealth, and order. A foreign envoy arriving at court could not help but notice them. It was in this context that the earliest seeds of the later obsession were planted. Frederick may not have cared exclusively about height, but he noticed, as others did, that tall men lent themselves to ceremony. They drew the eye, they lent dignity to processions, and they gave the impression that Brandenburg's ruler commanded a force of unusual quality. Tall grenadiers made excellent sentries for palace gates and imposing escorts for royal occasions. If your soldiers already looked like giants, why not lean into the image? Prestige in early modern Europe was as much about appearances as reality, and Frederick, like his peers, was eager to cultivate every advantage. Still, one must not imagine that Frederick's grenadiers were simply ornamental. Their early reputation was grounded in their effectiveness as soldiers. They drilled, they trained, and they could be deployed if need be. Brandenburg was not yet the major military power it would later become, and every capable soldier counted. But within this mixture of practicality and pageantry lay a subtle shift. As the grenadiers grew taller, their symbolic value began to rival their practical one. They were no longer just the men who could carry heavy grenades. They were the men who looked the part of a royal guard. It helped that Frederick himself was in the process of elevating his status. In 1701, he crowned himself King Frederick I of Prussia, a carefully negotiated maneuver that transformed Brandenburg Prussia into a kingdom recognized by other European powers. Such an elevation demanded spectacle, and his grenadiers provided it. Their uniforms grew more elaborate, their presence at court ceremonies more prominent. What had started as a practical corps of strong men was drifting toward the realm of prestige display. A grenadier of great height was not simply a soldier, but a living statement of royal ambition. The fascination with tall soldiers did not spring from nowhere. Across Europe, rulers had long been captivated by physical anomalies. Dwarfs, giants, strong men, and other curiosities often found places at court, sometimes as entertainers, sometimes as symbols of power. To command men of unusual height was to demonstrate that even the rarest of specimens could be gathered under one's authority. In this sense, Frederick's grenadiers reflected a broader cultural appetite for spectacle. But while most monarchs stopped at maintaining a few such figures for amusement, Frederick and his successors would push the idea much further, turning spectacle into an institution. By the late 17th century, visitors to Brandenburg began to comment on the unusual stature of Frederick's guard. They were not yet the infamous Potsdam giants, but the emphasis on height was already clear. Ambassadors described their imposing presence and noted the king's evident pride in them. A tall grenadier was a rare commodity, and to see so many gathered in one regiment suggested both wealth and determination. Other rulers might have been content with lavish costumes or elaborate ceremonies. Frederick preferred to make his soldiers into the showpiece. It was martial display with a hint of theatre. Of course, height was still a secondary concern. The grenadiers were expected to perform their duties, to drill and to fight if called upon. Frederick's own reign was marked by political manoeuvring, ceremonial display, and the careful construction of a new royal image rather than major military campaigns. In this environment, the grenadiers occupied a space between practical necessity and symbolic power. They were useful enough to justify their existence and impressive enough to enhance their master's reputation. It was not yet an absurdity, but the trajectory was set. The line between soldier and spectacle was beginning to blur. What makes this origin story significant is the way it reveals the gradual shift from function to fixation. A small corps of grenadiers was a sensible choice for a prince, seeking to elevate his stature in Europe. Yet the very qualities that made them useful, strength, discipline, and height, were also the qualities that lent themselves to exaggeration. Once the idea took hold that taller was better, the temptation to seek ever taller men became irresistible. Frederick may not have indulged the notion to excess, but he had set the precedent. The spectacle of tall grenadiers became a seed that would grow into a full-blown obsession in the next reign. When Prince Frederick of Brandenburg crowned himself King Frederick I of Prussia, he left behind a legacy of ceremonial grandeur and a respectable corps of tall grenadiers who had enhanced the dignity of his new royal court. Yet it was his son, Frederick William I, who inherited both the throne and the regiment, and in doing so, transformed a sensible guard into a spectacle bordering on the absurd. Known to history as the Soldier King, Frederick William I earned his title less through battlefield heroics and more through his single-minded devotion to military life. He ruled from 1713 until 1740, and in those decades he reshaped Prussia into a state organised almost entirely around its army. Yet within this framework of relentless discipline and austerity, he indulged in a fascination that seemed to contradict the rest of his personality, an obsession with tall soldiers. Frederick William was not a man given to frivolity. He detested luxury and ceremonial pomp, famously slashing the extravagant expenses of his father's court. Silks and entertainments gave way to uniforms and drill, and courtiers who had once thrived on elaborate etiquette found themselves dismissed or ignored. To his subjects, he appeared as a ruler of ruthless simplicity, a man who wore the same plain uniform day after day and who valued nothing more highly than efficiency. Yet this same ruler, so disdainful of waste and vanity, poured vast sums of money into cultivating a regiment of unusually tall men. The paradox was striking. In a kingdom where everything was to be lean and disciplined, the king's greatest indulgence was a collection of giants. To Frederick William, height was more than a curiosity. It was a personal delight, almost a source of comfort. He assembled the Langer curls into a regiment that served no strategic purpose, but instead catered to his fascination. Their size amused him, impressed foreign visitors, and provided him with a kind of living ornamentation. Unlike his father, who had valued the grenadiers as both soldiers and symbols, Frederick William stripped away the practical side and leaned entirely into the spectacle. Their function was to march in step, to stand guard at ceremonies, and most importantly, to give their king the pleasure of watching them. Accounts from the time suggest that Frederick William treated the regiment less like soldiers and more like prized pets. He lavished attention on them, personally inspecting their ranks, rewarding them with gifts, and even surrounding himself with them during moments of leisure. He was said to burst into delight at the sight of his giants marching past, as though the simple rhythm of tall men in uniform was enough to ease the burdens of kingship. In a court stripped of luxury, this was the king's entertainment, an endless procession of men chosen for the accident of their height. The regiment also became a point of pride, a physical manifestation of Frederick William's authority. To gather so many unusually tall men in one place was to demonstrate his power. Visitors to Berlin could not fail to notice them, and the king made sure they were displayed prominently. The Langer curls were marched out as living trophies, and their presence impressed some and bemused others. The irony was not lost on foreign dignitaries. Here was a monarch who demanded discipline and frugality from his people, yet indulged himself in a collection of men whose chief qualification was simply that they were tall enough to reach the top shelf without a ladder. The obsession went deeper than public display. Frederick William painted their portraits, commissioned engravings of them, and decorated his palaces with reminders of their height. In one famous anecdote, he was said to measure new recruits personally, gleefully recording their stature. The regiment was not simply a military unit. It was his hobby, his passion project, and in some ways, his escape from the tedium of administration. Where other rulers collected art or patronized composers, Frederick William collected men with long legs and tall hats. It was, in its way, a very human quirk, though magnified to grotesque proportions by the resources of a monarchy. It should not be imagined, however, that the giants themselves enjoyed the arrangement. While some undoubtedly appreciated the higher pay and lavish uniforms, others found the life intolerable. They had not enlisted for glory or service, but were instead turned into display pieces. Many were denied the chance to fight, their martial potential squandered on ceremonial duties. The very qualities that made them exceptional also trapped them in a regiment that existed only to indulge the king's whim. Some fell into melancholy, and there were reports of suicides among those who found the gilded cage too confining. For Frederick William, they were objects of delight. For many of the giants, it was a strange kind of prison. Still, the regiment flourished under his care, at least in terms of visibility. They became famous across Europe, not for their victories, but for their height. Foreign rulers knew of them, and travellers remarked upon their presence. Frederick William was not embarrassed by the absurdity. He leaned into it, treating their existence as proof of his power. If he could gather and maintain hundreds of giants, then what else might he command? In a world where prestige mattered as much as muskets, even this eccentricity had its propaganda value. Yet the regiment was always limited by a fundamental problem. There were never enough tall men to go around. However wide Frederick William cast his net, however much money he offered, the supply of unusually tall recruits was too small to satisfy him. His obsession demanded more than the population could naturally provide. The taller the soldiers he found, the more he craved new ones, even taller still. It became a cycle of desire and frustration, a royal passion forever undermined by biology. The regiment could never be as large as the king wanted because the world simply did not contain enough men of such extraordinary stature. This scarcity haunted the regiment throughout Frederick William's reign. No matter how many giants he gathered, the ranks always seemed too thin, the parade never quite tall enough. And so the king's mania grew, feeding upon itself, driving him to seek out recruits by any means available. The challenge of filling the regiment became as much a part of the obsession as the joy of watching it march. It was not enough to have a company of tall men. He dreamed of battalions, perhaps even entire armies, towering above the rest of Europe. But for that dream to come close to reality, he would have to resort to increasingly desperate methods of recruitment. At first, money was the king's chosen lure. Tall men were promised high pay and lavish rewards, a chance at comfort in exchange for endless parades. Recruiters scoured towns and villages, measuring farmhands and labourers, offering bonuses to those who stood above the common run. Some men were tempted, especially those who saw little hope in the plough or workshop. To be a Langer Kerl meant steady wages, fine uniforms, and in some cases the admiration of neighbours who saw them return in bright Prussian blue. Yet voluntary enlistment was never enough. Too many tall men had livelihoods they were unwilling to abandon, and many more had no interest in a regiment that offered pomp but little action. So bribery was joined by trickery. Recruiters became notorious for their tactics, slipping into taverns and markets with measuring sticks, sizing up potential giants under the pretext of conversation, then enticing them with false promises. There were stories of men lured across borders with the promise of work, only to find themselves pressed into military service once their height was revealed. What had begun as recruitment soon slipped into coercion. Frederick William cared little for the niceties of consent when the prize was a soldier who stood 6.5 feet tall. From there, it was a short step to outright kidnapping. Tall men travelling alone became targets, seized by Prussian agents, and hustled into service before they could protest. Reports spread of giants disappearing from roadsides, never to be seen again outside the king's regiment. Some were snatched in the dead of night, others tricked with strong drink, still others bought from unscrupulous employers willing to trade a tall labourer for a handful of coin. Prussia acquired a reputation as a place where a man of unusual stature could not walk safely, for at any moment he might find himself whisked away to Potsdam to join the endless parades. The tales of coercion and trade spread widely, adding to the regiment's infamy. Visitors to Prussia recorded stories of the king's obsession, noting how men of unusual size were drawn into his orbit, whether they wished it or not. Some found the anecdotes amusing, a colourful detail to share upon their return home. Others regarded it with unease, as evidence of a monarch whose whims overshadowed reason. Either way, the Lange curls became known not simply as tall soldiers, but as the unwilling trophies of a collector who would stop at nothing to fill his ranks. In Frederick William I's mind, there had to be rules. It was not enough to collect tall men by bribery, trickery, or diplomatic trade. They also had to meet a minimum standard that marked them off from the ordinary population. That standard, famously, was 6 Prussian feet, equivalent to just over 6 feet, 2 inches today. This was an extraordinary demand. It meant that the king was not merely gathering tall men. He was searching for physical rarities, human anomalies, who towered over their peers. To stand in his regiment was to be transformed into a living measurement, proof that you had crossed the invisible line between the common soldier and the king's prized possession. The number itself carried symbolic weight. 6 feet was tall in any age, but in the early 18th century it was nearly freakish. Farmers bent double in the fields, artisans stooped over benches, and soldiers hunched beneath the weight of muskets and packs. Among them, a 6'2" grenadier looked like a giant from another world. Even before uniform and drill lent him grandeur, his body alone commanded attention. This, of course, was precisely the point. Frederick William wanted men who could not blend into a crowd, who looked different simply by existing. To parade them was to emphasize their otherness, to show that he could command what nature produced, only rarely and scatteringly across Europe. The practical difficulties of meeting this requirement were immense. Every inch above average made a candidate rarer, and by the time one approached 7 feet, a man was as uncommon as a diamond. Such individuals drew notice wherever they went, often displayed in fairs or treated as curiosities even before the Prussians arrived. The king's agents knew this and pursued them relentlessly, sometimes offering extraordinary sums to lure them away from their lives. Tales circulated of the king paying enormous bounties for a man of unusual stature, treating him like a jewel to be set in his regimental crown. For the men themselves, the requirement could feel less like an honour than a sentence. Height, after all, was not something they had chosen. A farmer's son who happened to grow a head taller than his brothers might suddenly find himself marked for service he had no desire to undertake. Merchants, craftsmen, and even peasants were measured in markets and on roads, their lives upended by the accident of their bodies. While some welcomed the attention, many more dreaded it. To stand above 6 Prussian feet was to stand in constant danger of conscription. The very trait that might once have made you an object of admiration now painted a target on your back. This lack of choice lay at the heart of the regiment's reputation. In ordinary circumstances, military service could be avoided, or at least bargained with. A man might pay for a substitute, or find ways to dodge recruiters. But when it came to the Lange curls, there was little mercy. No substitutes could replace the inches that Frederick William demanded. No payment could reduce your height once it had been measured. If you met the requirement, your fate was largely sealed. The king's obsession allowed no exemptions. Even noblemen of uncommon stature sometimes found themselves pressured into the regiment, proof that height overruled status when it came to pleasing the soldier king. It was not just the lower bound of 6 feet 2 inches that mattered. The taller a man was, the greater his value. Those who approached 7 feet were treated as wonders of nature. Frederick William was particularly delighted by such extremes, lavishing attention upon them as though they were royal treasures. Contemporary accounts suggest that he treated them with special indulgence, sometimes refusing to allow them to serve in any ordinary capacity lest they risk injury. Instead, they were set apart for display, their lives reduced to standing still in splendid uniforms, while their monarch gazed at them with satisfaction. What might have seemed like protection was, in fact, another kind of imprisonment, a life in which one's exceptional height became a cage. The regiment's requirements also had unintended consequences. Because height was so rare, men who were close to the boundary were often manipulated or mismeasured. Some accounts suggest that recruiters would stretch the truth, or the men themselves, to reach the standard. Wooden blocks in boots, exaggerated posture during measurement, and creative interpretations of what exactly counted as 6 Prussian feet were not unknown. The line between genuine qualification and forced inclusion was blurry, and in a kingdom ruled by a man's obsession, it was often the king himself who decided whether someone was tall enough. Measurement became ritual, and the tape or rod was imbued with the weight of royal will. To those inside Prussia, the sight of the giants was both impressive and unsettling. Onlookers admired the spectacle, but they also understood that these men had been singled out by forces beyond their control. A village might lose its tallest son not to war or famine, but to a parade ground in Potsdam. Families whispered about height, the way others spoke of misfortune, as though growing too tall might doom a young man to vanish into the king's regiment. In such a society, being shorter could be a blessing, while towering above your neighbours might bring wealth, but also unwanted attention from which there was no escape. The irony was not lost on foreign observers. They noted the lavish attention given to the giants, but also the unhappiness that sometimes followed. Men who had never wished for military life found themselves imprisoned in it. Others, who might have dreamed of using their size for personal gain, discovered that their bodies had been claimed by a monarch's obsession. The regiment was both privilege and punishment. Privilege because its members received higher pay and finer treatment than many soldiers. Punishment because their freedom had been stolen by the accident of their growth. The requirement turned biology into destiny, and destiny into captivity. Height, then, became the single most important currency in Frederick William's peculiar economy of spectacle. Wealth, skill, bravery. These mattered far less than inches measured against a wooden rod. In elevating height above all else, the king reduced his soldiers to living artifacts, judged not by their actions but by their measurements. The regiment was a reminder that power could distort values, turning human beings into collectibles, and that in Prussia, under the soldier king, to stand tall was to stand marked. Once a man had been measured, approved, and folded into the ranks of the Lange curls, his life took on a peculiar rhythm. He entered not the world of campaigns and marches across Europe, but a smaller stage set almost entirely in Potsdam and Berlin. Here, height was currency, and the taller the soldier, the more closely he was displayed. Life in the regiment was structured less around battle readiness than around ceremony, presentation, and the constant demand to impress one man. Frederick William I. For many of the giants, this existence felt surreal. They had been conscripted, bribed, or gifted to a monarch, only to discover that their grand military career amounted to standing in splendid uniforms and moving in step before a delighted king. The uniforms themselves became a symbol of this strange existence. The Lange curls were dressed in elaborate attire, designed not for practicality in combat, but for maximum effect on parade. Bright blue coats with red facings, tall mitre caps that exaggerated their already unusual height, and polished muskets completed the image. Frederick William delighted in these details, insisting that his giants should look like no other regiment in Europe. He paid close attention to their appearance, sometimes personally inspecting their dress and equipment. The result was a regiment that looked magnificent, towering in their finery, but whose finery underscored the gap between image and reality. They were soldiers who resembled figures from a stage play, uniformed for display rather than survival. Pay and privileges were another part of the bargain. The giants received higher wages than ordinary soldiers, and in some cases they were indulged with better food and lodgings. For Frederick William, this was not generosity so much as investment. His prized possessions needed to be maintained, and he understood that money could at least reduce their resentment. The promise of higher pay was also a lure for recruits. Though not always sufficient to overcome reluctance, those who stayed sometimes found small comforts in their privileges, enjoying a better standard of living than their shorter countrymen. Yet privilege did not always translate into satisfaction. To be well fed and well paid was not necessarily to be happy, particularly when one's service was reduced to endless repetition. The central duty of the regiment was not to fight, but to march. Day after day, the Langer curls drilled, their long legs swinging in careful unison, their muskets polished and shouldered, their bright uniforms gleaming in the sun. They were paraded before the king, stationed at ceremonial posts, and wheeled out on special occasions to astonish guests. For Frederick William, this was an unending source of joy. He never tired of watching them, and he insisted on their regular performance. But for the men themselves, the routine quickly wore thin. Soldiers generally expect hardship, but they also expect purpose. To march without end, to polish and polish again, to present oneself as spectacle rather than warrior. This was a life many found unbearable. Some endured it stoically, taking pride in their uniforms, or in the simple fact that they were part of a unique corps. Others, however, grew restless and resentful. They had imagined military service as dangerous but meaningful, something tied to loyalty, duty, or even adventure. Instead, they found themselves reduced to ornaments, kept for show like caged animals. Letters and memoirs from those who encountered the regiment often noted their sullenness, their sense of melancholy. It is not difficult to imagine why. To be trapped by one's body, celebrated for it, and yet imprisoned by it, was a fate that many could not reconcile. The psychological toll could be severe. Reports of suicide among the Langer curls circulated during Frederick William's reign, a grim counterpoint to the cheer he derived from their parades. Some men simply could not bear the monotony, the loss of autonomy, or the sense that they had become curiosities rather than human beings. Others drank heavily, a common outlet in the 18th century, but one that led to its own miseries. For those who had been coerced into the regiment, the despair could be sharper still. They had not volunteered for this life, and though they were paid and dressed in finery, they lived each day as unwilling participants in another man's obsession. Frederick William attempted to offset this discontent with gestures of affection. He was known to give gifts to his giants, to visit them in their barracks, and to maintain a personal interest in their welfare. He sometimes treated them with a rough sort of paternalism, scolding them like children, or rewarding them for their appearance on parade. Yet these efforts rarely addressed the deeper issue that their lives were not their own. To be one of the Langer curls was to be defined by height and nothing else. Whatever one's personal ambitions, skills, or desires, they were irrelevant in the face of the measuring stick. The regiment's existence also revealed the strange contrast within Prussian society under the soldier king. Ordinary soldiers drilled relentlessly, prepared for the wars that defined the early 18th century. Officers were expected to demonstrate efficiency, courage, and loyalty. The state itself was organized around discipline, taxation, and service. And yet, at the very heart of this machine, stood a regiment exempt from all of that. Men who never fought, who did not contribute to campaigns, who existed solely to gratify the monarch. They were both elevated and diminished, elevated by their privileges, diminished by their purpose. In this contradiction lay the absurdity that made the regiment famous. It is tempting to see in the Langer curls an early example of the dehumanizing effects of spectacle. The men were reduced to symbols, their individuality erased beneath uniforms and measurements. They were celebrated for what they represented, not who they were. To the king they were objects of pride, living proof of his ability to command the rarest men. To the world they were curiosities, a story to tell of Prussia's eccentric monarch. But to themselves many must have felt like prisoners, rewarded yet trapped, admired yet ignored as human beings. The regiment endured despite this unhappiness, for Frederick William's passion gave it constant momentum. He was tireless in his attention to them, and his delight never waned. If one giant fell into despair or disappeared, another was found to take his place. The cycle of recruitment, display, and loss continued year after year, the regiment swelling and thinning as fortune allowed. Their existence was as much a monument to the king's willpower as to their own endurance. But the king was not blind to the limitations of nature. He could see, as his agents constantly reported, that there were never enough giants to satisfy him. No matter how many he gathered, the pool of tall men in Europe was finite, and many resisted his grasp. This frustration gnawed at him, and in time it led to a new and even stranger idea. If nature could not produce enough tall men, then perhaps nature could be guided. The idea was simple in concept, if grotesque in execution. If tall men were scarce, why not breed them? Frederick William arranged marriages between his tallest soldiers and tall women, with the explicit goal of producing children who would one day stand head and shoulders above their peers. These were not romantic unions, but experiments in human husbandry, conceived with the same logic one might apply to breeding horses or cattle. The king believed that, with time, this program could ensure a steady supply of Langer curls, born and raised within Prussia itself. The regiment would then no longer depend upon the whims of recruitment or the generosity of foreign rulers. It would become self-sustaining, a hereditary line of giants marching forever under his banner. To modern ears, this sounds grotesque, and indeed it was. Human beings were reduced to breeding stock, their personal desires irrelevant in the face of royal obsession. The soldiers involved had no real choice in the matter. If they were selected for their height, they were expected to comply. The women, too, were chosen less for who they were than for their stature, and sometimes for their ability to bear large children. The king's program assumed that height could be carefully cultivated through deliberate pairing, as though soldiers could be grown like crops. It was an early and chilling example of selective breeding applied to human beings, centuries before the word eugenics would be coined. Accounts of these breeding experiments suggest that Frederick William pursued them with the same enthusiasm he brought to his parades. He monitored the results, expressed delight at tall offspring, and spoke openly of his intentions. He was not embarrassed by the program. He saw it as a sensible solution to a problem that had plagued his regiment since its creation. To him, this was simply another form of discipline applied to human material. If soldiers could be drilled into obedience, why not bred into stature? The king's blunt practicality and obsession combined in a scheme that horrified some observers, but entertained others, who could scarcely believe the extent of his fixation. The results were, at best, uncertain. Height is not so easily engineered, and heredity is more complicated than Frederick William understood. While some pairings did produce tall sons, others yielded children no taller than their neighbours. Biology refused to bend entirely to royal will, and the king could not force nature to obey his measuring stick. Yet the very attempt spoke volumes about his mindset. For Frederick William, soldiers were not individuals, but resources to be managed, improved, and displayed. If they could be drilled, they could be bred. If they could be bred, they could be perfected. The fact that the project was both intrusive and ineffective did little to dull his enthusiasm. Later generations would look back on this program with a mixture of horror and fascination. Charles Darwin himself, in discussing the principles of heredity, mentioned the Potsdam giants as a curious case of human selective breeding. That Frederick William's experiments entered the annals of scientific commentary is telling, for they represented a rare moment when the ambitions of monarchy collided directly with the mysteries of biology. The Soldier King did not set out to advance science, of course. His aims were far narrower. Yet in his relentless pursuit of height, he inadvertently provided posterity with one of the earliest examples of applied selective breeding in human history. For the soldiers and women caught in the scheme, however, there was little consolation in being remembered as a case study. Their lives were redirected to serve a program that viewed them as bodies rather than people. Marriage became less a matter of affection or alliance than of inches measured from heel to crown. Children were celebrated or disappointed over, not for their health or character, but for their size. The entire process stripped individuality away, replacing it with a cold arithmetic of stature. Frederick William may have been delighted, but his subjects bore the true weight of his obsession. The wider world, meanwhile, continued to watch with bemusement. News of the breeding program spread among European courts, adding to Frederick William's reputation as both a disciplinarian and an eccentric. Some rulers found it laughable, others treated it as further proof that Prussia's monarch was unlike any other. Foreign visitors to Potsdam might be shown the towering grenadiers and told of the king's plans to grow more of them at home as though they were a crop of potatoes. To some, it confirmed Prussia's reputation for militarism taken to extremes. To others, it was simply another anecdote to tell upon returning home, a story of a king so fixated on tall soldiers that he tried to breed them like livestock. If Frederick William's breeding schemes revealed the depth of his obsession, it was his dealings with foreign rulers that exposed its absurdity most clearly. Height, in his peculiar economy, was not only a measure of a man's worth but also a form of currency. Just as jewels, fine horses, or rare artworks might circulate as tokens of favour between monarchs, so too did tall soldiers. A giant could be offered in exchange for alliance, goodwill, or treasures of immense cultural value. It was a practice that reduced human beings to collectibles, tokens to be traded across borders, all to satisfy the whims of one king. The most famous example came in the form of Russia's Peter the Great. Himself a towering man at more than 6.5 feet, Peter understood the appeal of height and recognised Frederick William's appetite for it. In a gesture of friendship, he sent several of his own unusually tall soldiers to Prussia. To Peter, this was a small price to pay for closer ties. To Frederick William, it was a triumph. The arrival of these Russian giants caused a sensation in Potsdam, where they were quickly absorbed into the regiment and displayed with pride. That these men had been uprooted from their homeland mattered little. Their new role was to stand tall under a Prussian uniform, living symbols of the bond between two monarchs. Other rulers soon followed suit. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire dispatched tall men from his dominions as part of diplomatic exchanges, signalling goodwill in a way uniquely tailored to Frederick William's tastes. Even minor princes and envoys sought to curry favour by presenting the king with men of unusual stature. Stories circulated of ambassadors scouring their own lands for tall subjects to gift, knowing that nothing would please the soldier king more than another towering recruit. Where one monarch might flatter with jewels or tapestries, Frederick William could be won over by the sight of a man who scraped the ceiling beams. Perhaps the most infamous transaction involved the Amber Room, the fabled chamber of amber panels, mirrors, and gilded carvings that would later become one of Europe's lost treasures. Frederick William traded this masterpiece to Peter the Great in exchange for, among other things, tall soldiers. The exchange symbolized the bizarre logic of his reign: priceless art for priceless height. Where other monarchs bartered over land, trade, or wealth, Frederick William was content to part with one of the wonders of his age so long as he could add a few more inches to his parade ground. The deal enriched Russia's palaces while enlarging the Prussian regiment, a reminder of how human bodies could be treated as commodities in the economy of royal vanity. The absurdity of these exchanges was not lost on contemporaries. Observers from abroad recorded their astonishment at a king who valued tall men more than treasures. Some wrote with amusement, others with thinly veiled criticism, noting how Frederick William's obsession distorted both diplomacy and morality. The giants themselves, meanwhile, had little say in the matter. They were uprooted, shipped across borders, and deposited into a regiment where their sole duty was to march and stand tall. A soldier might one day be the pride of his village, the curiosity of a fair, or the delight of his family, only to be presented as a gift to a distant king and transformed into a living ornament of a foreign court. This reduction of men to collectibles highlights the strangeness of Frederick William's project. The giants were valued less as people than as objects, appreciated not for their thoughts, skills, or ambitions, but for the measurement of their bones. They were, in effect, living curiosities, gathered and displayed much as one might assemble an art collection or a cabinet of exotic specimens. Monarchs of the period often collected the unusual, rare animals, shells, gemstones, or automata, but Frederick William's cabinet was composed of living men, each carefully chosen for his ability to tower above the crowd. The practice of gifting tall soldiers also reinforced Frederick William's sense of power. Every man he received was proof that foreign courts recognized his obsession and catered to it. Each new arrival stood as a visible reminder that Prussia's king could command not only the loyalty of his subjects, but the compliance of other rulers. To parade these men before visiting dignitaries was to showcase both his collection and his influence. The Langer curls became a gallery not only of tall bodies, but of international diplomacy embodied in human form. For the men themselves, life in this strange role could be bewildering. One day they were subjects of the Tsar, the Sultan, or some smaller prince. The next they were Prussian grenadiers, repainted in blue and red, their futures decided by a transaction in which they had no voice. Their fate was sealed by their height, and their existence as gifts confirmed the extent to which power could strip away autonomy. They might be fed, clothed, and treated with a degree of respect, but they were no less collectibles than the amber panels traded for their presence. Their worth was defined by inches, their destiny dictated by the desires of distant monarchs. The absurdity of the practice was magnified by the seriousness with which Frederick William treated his acquisitions. He did not regard them as mere novelties to be forgotten in a corner. He adored them, displayed them, and revelled in their presence. He marched them out like treasures, painted their likenesses, and measured them with delight. Each new arrival brought him visible joy, as though the collection had been enlarged by a rare jewel or painting. The king who despised luxury and scorned frivolity nonetheless built his greatest indulgence around the most frivolous currency imaginable: height. Diplomats, courtiers, and commoners alike came to recognize this obsession as a defining feature of his reign. To speak of Prussia under Frederick William was to speak of discipline, austerity, and tall soldiers. The lange curls were woven into the image of the state, not because they fought wars or defended borders, but because they gratified the king's peculiar taste. They were the ultimate display of his authority, living proof that even the rarest of men could be gathered, traded, and paraded at his command. By the time Frederick William I had filled his regiment with recruits, gifts, and the occasional manufactured giant, the Potsdam barracks resembled less a military installation than a kind of living museum. What had begun as an elite grenadier guard under his father, and what had grown into a vanity project under his own reign, now became the centrepiece of his personal amusement. To call the lange curls soldiers was almost misleading. They were exhibits displayed and admired in the same way a collector might gaze at rare coins or stuffed animals in glass cases. Except these exhibits wore bright uniforms, moved in step and, much to the king's satisfaction, stood several inches taller than anyone else in Europe. The king's indulgence in this collection was boundless. He had their portraits painted with obsessive regularity, capturing not only their towering forms, but their distinctive faces and postures. Visitors to his palaces might encounter long corridors lined with images of the giants, as though the regiment extended endlessly along the walls. Frederick William was not content to admire them only in person. He wanted them immortalized in oil and canvas, their likenesses preserved like treasures. It was the same impulse that drove him to collect them in the first place, a desire to make the rare permanent, to hold on to a fleeting marvel by sheer force of will. Portraits were only one part of the spectacle. The real pleasure came from watching the giants move. The regiment was paraded before the king at every opportunity, their long legs swinging in unison, their mitre caps pushing their apparent height even further. To an outsider, it might have looked like a drill exercise. To Frederick William, it was theatre. He delighted in the rhythm of their march, the gleam of their uniforms, the absurd sight of hundreds of towering men obeying his command. Some observers claimed that the king could sit for hours watching them, never tiring of the repetition. In a reign otherwise marked by austerity and discipline, this was his guilty indulgence, the one extravagance he permitted himself without hesitation. At times he surrounded himself with giants simply for the pleasure of their company. Accounts describe evenings when the king would dine or relax while tall soldiers stood nearby, their presence less a matter of security than of spectacle. It was as though he drew comfort from being encircled by men who represented the physical ideal he most admired. To others, it might have seemed intimidating. To Frederick William, it was reassuring, a reminder that he alone commanded this peculiar gallery of humanity. He loved them not as individuals, but as embodiments of a single quality. Height and their presence gratified him more than any banquet or opera ever could. The regiment functioned as a cabinet of curiosities, a concept well known in the 18th century. Wealthy men assembled rare shells, exotic animals, ancient coins or natural oddities, arranging them in displays that impressed visitors with the breadth of their collection. Frederick William did the same, except his specimens were alive and in uniform. He paraded them as proof of his power, each man a walking curiosity, admired less for his skill than for his rarity. Just as a noble might boast of a rare gemstone, the soldier king boasted of a grenadier who stood 7 feet tall. To reduce human beings to curiosities was strange enough. To build an entire regiment out of them was uniquely absurd. Efficiency and combat readiness, normally the hallmarks of a regiment's worth, were irrelevant here. The lange curls did not train for battle in any serious sense. Their muskets were polished, their drill perfected, but their duties ended at the parade ground. Frederick William never intended to risk them in combat. They were too valuable, too rare, too precious to be squandered on the unpredictable chaos of war. Ordinary soldiers might bleed and die in Europe's campaigns, but the giants remained at home, preserved like heirlooms. The irony was sharp. In a kingdom defined by militarism, the king's most famous regiment was never truly military at all. This contradiction was not lost on foreign observers. Diplomats who visited Prussia often remarked on the oddity of a ruler so devoted to efficiency and discipline indulging in such a frivolous project. They were impressed by the sight of the giants, of course. Who would not be, when faced with men who towered above their peers? But beneath their admiration lay bemusement, even ridicule. To maintain such a regiment, at such expense and for no purpose beyond spectacle, seemed a folly unworthy of a state that prided itself on hard-nosed realism. Yet the soldier king did not mind the laughter of others. If anything, he leaned into the absurdity, convinced that his collection enhanced both his personal joy and the prestige of his monarchy. The giants themselves had little choice in the matter. They marched when ordered, stood when commanded, and endured the endless rituals of display. Some may have felt pride in their unique role, enjoying the privileges and the fame that came with it. Others sank into boredom, depression, or resentment, their lives reduced to endless repetition. But whether they found joy or despair, their feelings mattered little to the king. For Frederick William, they were instruments of delight, not men with inner lives. Their value lay in their height and their obedience, nothing more. One cannot help but sense the absurdity when imagining the scene. A monarch who slashed his court's luxuries, who wore the same plain uniform day after day, who preached austerity and frugality to his people, nonetheless indulged himself in this extravagant spectacle. He scorned operas and ballets as frivolous wastes of money, but replaced them with a theatre of his own making, tall men marching endlessly for his amusement. It was extravagance disguised as discipline, indulgence dressed in uniform. The Lange curls were the king's opera, his art collection, his entertainment, all in one. For decades, this spectacle defined Frederick William's reign. Visitors expected to see the giants, and he never failed to oblige them. The regiment was woven into the fabric of his rule, as much a symbol of his authority as his policies or his armies. Yet the very fact that it depended so completely on his personal obsession made its future uncertain. Without his enthusiasm, without his indulgence, what purpose would the giants serve? They were not a practical regiment, nor a necessary one. They were at heart an indulgence, and indulgences rarely survive their patrons. When Frederick William I died in 1740, the fate of his beloved giants hung in the balance. The regiment that had absorbed so much of his energy, that had been paraded like a private opera for decades, was tied so completely to his peculiar passions that it could not help but change under new management. His son, Frederick II, later known to history as Frederick the Great, had spent his youth watching his father's eccentricities with a mixture of dread and disdain. To the younger Frederick, the Lange curls were not a symbol of strength, but a symbol of waste, a regiment that devoured money and manpower without offering anything in return. Where his father saw delight and prestige, the son saw an indulgence that had no place in the efficient, modern army he intended to build. Frederick the Great was not blind to the absurdity of the regiment. He had grown up under the shadow of his father's obsession, forced to witness endless parades, portraits, and ceremonies in which tall soldiers were elevated above all others. His relationship with his father had been strained, marked by punishments, strict discipline, and humiliations designed to crush the boy's spirit. To a son who resented his father's cruelty, the Lange curls were perhaps the clearest example of everything wrong with his reign: arbitrary, frivolous, and suffocating. When he inherited the throne, Frederick wasted little time in downgrading the regiment, stripping it of its special privileges and folding it into more ordinary service. The transformation was swift. The giants lost their pampered role as royal curiosities and became, for the first time, soldiers expected to serve in campaigns. No longer were they displayed like treasures to amuse a monarch. Now they drilled and marched alongside their shorter comrades, their unusual height offering little advantage on the battlefield. The parade ground was no longer their primary stage, and the endless cycles of showmanship that had defined their existence faded into memory. For many of the giants, this was a shock. They had grown accustomed to better pay, better food, and the certainty that they would never be asked to risk themselves in battle. Under Frederick the Great, that protection evaporated. It was not simply that Frederick disliked the regiment, he actively saw it as a hindrance. The resources his father had poured into the Lange Kerls could, in his eyes, be better spent on artillery, cavalry, or the training of officers. To waste money on decorative giants was, to Frederick, an insult to the army's true purpose. He prided himself on being a practical man of war, one who would win battles through strategy and discipline rather than spectacle. The giants, with their gilded history and ceremonial reputation, represented the opposite of everything he valued. By reducing them to ordinary status, he sent a clear message. Under his reign, efficiency and effectiveness would replace eccentricity. The decline of the regiment was not simply administrative, it was also symbolic. For decades, the Lange Kerls had embodied Frederick William's willpower and obsession. Their uniforms, their portraits, their parades, all were extensions of a monarch who believed his happiness could be measured in inches of soldierly height. With his death, that meaning dissolved. They no longer symbolized royal pride, they symbolized waste. The contrast between father and son could not have been sharper. One had delighted in towering men marching for pleasure, the other dismissed them as impractical relics. Where once the regiment had stood at the centre of Prussia's spectacle, it now receded into the background of its wars. For the soldiers themselves, this shift brought both relief and danger. Relief because some had long grown weary of being treated as curiosities, their lives reduced to endless ceremonial duties. Now at last, they could serve as real soldiers, judged for something beyond their height. But danger, because this new role meant facing the realities of war that they had previously been spared. Many had little desire for battle. Some were too large for the rigours of campaign, their bodies unsuited to the long marches and harsh conditions of warfare. Their unusual size, once celebrated, could become a liability when food was scarce, uniforms ill-fitting, or wounds slow to heal. As the decades passed, the regiment's distinctiveness eroded. They became one unit among many, no longer pampered, no longer indulged. Foreign visitors stopped remarking on them as marvels. Diplomats no longer rushed to flatter the king with gifts of tall men. The fascination that had defined Frederick William's reign was replaced by the hard realities of Frederick the Great's wars. Campaigns fought across Europe that demanded discipline, strategy, and endurance rather than spectacle. The giants melted into the ranks, their uniqueness fading as Prussia turned its attention to conquest. Yet even in decline, the regiment retained a faint echo of its former strangeness. Stories of the old days lingered, tales of a king who had painted his giants and paraded them endlessly for amusement. Older soldiers who had lived under Frederick William remembered the peculiar privileges of their youth, even as they now marched and fought under very different circumstances. The memory of being collectibles, pampered and displayed, clashed with the new reality of being expendable soldiers. In that tension lay the measure of their decline, from prized possessions to ordinary men, from jewels in the crown to anonymous faces in the line. The change also reflected broader shifts in Prussia itself. Under Frederick William, the state had been austere, disciplined, but also eccentric, moulded around one man's peculiar tastes. Under Frederick the Great, it became sharper, more efficient, more ruthlessly focused on military success. The disappearance of the Lange Curls as a special regiment mirrored the disappearance of whimsy from the machinery of the state. Prussia could no longer afford indulgences when its king demanded victories. The giants, once symbols of vanity, now represented only the past, a reminder of an era of absurdity that had no place in the wars of the mid-18th century. Even after Frederick the Great's reign ended, the decline of the regiment continued. The giants were never restored to their former glory, for no monarch after Frederick William shared his peculiar obsession. They lingered on as a unit in name, but their distinctiveness had evaporated. They marched where they were told, fought when commanded, and bled alongside the rest of Prussia's armies. The gilded cage of privilege had given way to the grim equality of military service. They had become what they had never truly been under their founder, ordinary soldiers. By the dawn of the 19th century, the regiment that had once dazzled Frederick William I and bemused all of Europe was already a hollow shell of its former self. The Lange Curls, who had once been pampered like prized collectibles, had long since lost their special status under Frederick the Great. They had marched and fought as ordinary soldiers, their towering frames no longer treated as objects of delight, but as expendable assets in Prussia's endless wars. Their uniforms, once designed for show, had grown indistinguishable from the rest. Their ceremonial parades had faded into memory. And yet, the name lingered, attached to a regiment that still carried the echo of a peculiar history. The final blow came in 1806, when Prussia met the full force of Napoleon's armies. The battles of Jena and Auerstedt shattered Prussia's military pride. Decades of discipline and tradition, built painstakingly by Frederick William and his son, crumbled in the face of French innovation and overwhelming force. The Prussian army, long regarded as one of the most efficient in Europe, was humiliated. In the midst of this collapse, there was no place for vanity regiments, no room for indulgences born of obsession. The Potsdam giants, already diminished, were swept away in the tide of defeat. Napoleon himself, amused by tales of the Lange Curls, supposedly mocked their very existence. What use, he asked, was a regiment selected for height when it could not stand against his legions? In the logic of Napoleonic warfare, where speed, artillery, and manoeuvre decided battles, a soldier's inches above average meant nothing. The spectacle that had once defined Prussia became an object of ridicule, another reminder of how eccentricity had wasted resources that could have been put to better use. For Napoleon, the defeat of the giants symbolized the defeat of Prussia itself, a kingdom trapped between its stern military reputation and the strange indulgences of its rulers. With the French victory came sweeping reforms. Napoleon and his allies dictated terms that forced Prussia to reduce its army and reorganize its institutions. Among the many units dissolved was the regiment of the Lange Curls. There was no practical reason to preserve them, and every financial reason to abandon them. The cult of height that had once defined a monarch's passion no longer held sway in a Europe reshaped by French power. The regiment was officially disbanded, and with its disbandment, the long spectacle of Prussia's giants came to an end. For the men themselves, the end was unremarkable, even anticlimactic. Some were absorbed into other regiments, their unusual height now little more than a curiosity on the battlefield. They fought and marched alongside shorter comrades, no longer set apart by privilege or display. Others slipped quietly into civilian life, returning to villages or towns that may have once watched them depart with astonishment. A few lingered in obscurity, their past service in the king's peculiar regiment remembered only in fragments of local gossip or family stories. The disbandment dissolved not only the regiment's name, but its aura. The giants became men again, stripped of the spectacle that had defined them. It is telling that their end came with so little ceremony. A regiment that had once been painted, paraded, and prized as though it were the jewel of a kingdom, vanished with barely a note of farewell. Their dispersal was practical, administrative, unromantic. In a Europe consumed by Napoleonic conflict, there was no time for nostalgia over Frederick William's indulgence. The Langer curls had outlived their purpose long before 1806, and their final disappearance was merely the official acknowledgement of what had been true for decades. They no longer mattered. Still, the memory of the regiment lingered, if only because it was too strange to forget. Chroniclers and visitors wrote of the absurdity of a king who had traded treasures for tall men, who had painted and pampered them, who had treated them as a living cabinet of curiosities. Soldiers who had served among them carried away stories of giants who had once marched endlessly for the amusement of a monarch. Foreign observers repeated tales of kidnappings, breeding experiments, and diplomatic gifts. The regiment's fame outlasted its existence, not because it had won battles or shaped history, but because it had embodied the eccentricity of absolute power in its purest form. For Prussia itself, the end of the Langer curls was part of a broader reckoning. The defeats of 1806 forced the kingdom to abandon indulgences, re-examine its institutions, and rebuild its military on new principles. Reformers such as Scharnhorst and Gneisenau recognised that the age of spectacle was over. Survival now demanded efficiency, modernisation, and merit. The giants had no place in this new vision. Their very existence was a reminder of wasted resources, of a king who had elevated whim over necessity. In the harsh new order of Napoleonic Europe, where every regiment had to earn its keep on the battlefield, the Langer curls were an anachronism. Yet their story raises the question of what, in the end, it all amounted to. For decades, men had been kidnapped, bribed, or gifted into the regiment. Families had watched their tallest sons vanish into Potsdam. A king had poured wealth and energy into acquiring and displaying them. Portraits had been painted, gifts exchanged, breeding schemes attempted, all for a regiment that never fired a meaningful shot in battle and ended in quiet dispersal. Their legacy was not victory or glory, but anecdote and incredulity. They existed not as a turning point in military history, but as a cautionary tale of how power can be wasted in pursuit of absurdity. In this sense, the disbandment of the giants was less an end than a transformation. They ceased to exist as soldiers, but they lived on as symbols of eccentric monarchy, of human beings reduced to curiosities, of the thin line between discipline and indulgence. Their story would be retold by historians, mocked by commentators, and even cited by scientists exploring heredity. They would never again march in Potsdam, but they would march on in memory, their towering forms frozen in portraits and anecdotes. When one thinks of Prussia, the first images that usually come to mind are those of discipline and innovation. The kingdom earned a reputation for its rigid order, its relentless drilling, and its armies that marched with mechanical precision. Later centuries would look back on Prussia as a state that embodied militarism, a place where the line between civilian and soldier was often blurred, where kings styled themselves as generals first and monarchs second. In many respects, this reputation was well earned. The Prussian army became one of the most respected institutions in Europe, shaping not only the destiny of the kingdom, but also the balance of power across the continent. And yet, running parallel to this stern and serious image was a story so bizarre, so indulgent, that it threatens to undermine the gravitas of the entire narrative. For several decades, one of the most famous regiments in Prussia was not known for its bravery, skill, or victories, but simply for being unusually tall. The story of the Potsdam giants sits awkwardly beside Prussia's celebrated legacy of military efficiency. While reformers and strategists toiled to make the army more effective, Frederick William I devoted enormous attention to a vanity project that offered little return beyond personal amusement. He poured money into recruiting tall men, traded treasures for their bodies, experimented with breeding schemes, and paraded them endlessly through Potsdam. This was not military innovation, it was indulgence masquerading as discipline. It was the clearest possible example of how absolute power can distort priorities, how a ruler's whims can become policy, and how soldiers can be reduced to collectibles when viewed through the lens of obsession. The irony lies in how little the giants ultimately mattered. They never changed the course of a battle. They never saved Prussia from defeat or propelled it to glory. Their muskets were rarely fired in anger, their tall forms rarely seen on campaign. For all the attention lavished upon them, they contributed almost nothing to the reputation of Prussia as a military power. That reputation was forged instead by ordinary soldiers drilling on parade grounds, by officers honing tactics, by generals who understood logistics and manoeuvre. The true strength of Prussia lay in its discipline, not in its indulgences. The giants, for all their height, were a footnote rather than a foundation. Yet the very absurdity of their existence ensures that they are remembered. Histories of Prussia often cannot resist pausing to mention the regiment of giants, if only because it offers such a stark contrast to the otherwise sober image of the state. Foreign visitors marvelled at them, diplomats joked about them, and later historians treated them as an example of royal eccentricity at its most extravagant. Even Charles Darwin mentioned them in his discussion of heredity, a strange afterlife for men who had once been paraded like jewels. In this sense, their legacy endures not because they were useful, but because they were so strikingly useless. They are remembered precisely because they embodied absurdity. The human cost of this indulgence should not be overlooked. Behind the stories of parades and portraits were men who had been bribed, kidnapped, or traded like objects. Families lost their tallest sons to a regiment they had no choice but to join. Some soldiers grew despondent, their lives drained of meaning by endless ceremonial duties. A few took their own lives rather than endure the monotony of being prized for inches rather than deeds. Others languished in obscurity, remembered only in anecdotes or portraits that flattened them into curiosities. For all the king's joy, the regiment was also a sight of quiet suffering, of men reduced to symbols rather than allowed to live as individuals. What, then, does one make of it all? Was it a harmless eccentricity, the indulgence of a monarch who otherwise ruled with stern efficiency? Or was it a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without restraint can lead to grotesque distortions of purpose? Perhaps it was both. The giants embodied the contradiction at the heart of Frederick William's reign, a king who preached austerity and discipline, yet lavished endless attention on a regiment that served no real purpose. He was the soldier king, but he was also the collector king, a man who treated human beings as trophies. In this contradiction lies the reason the giants remain so memorable. They remind us that even the most serious states can harbour absurdities, and that even the most disciplined rulers can indulge in vanity. The regiment's end in 1806, swallowed up by Napoleon's victories and Prussia's humiliation, might have consigned them to oblivion. Yet their story persists, repeated in histories, remembered in paintings, and retold as a kind of historical curiosity. Their tall shadows stretch through time, not because they changed history, but because they illustrate it in such a peculiar light. They stand as a warning against the folly of power and as a reminder of how easily human beings can be transformed into symbols when one man's obsession becomes law. In the end, the image that lingers is not of battles fought or victories won, but of tall men marching endlessly on a parade ground, their boots striking the cobblestones in rhythm, their bright uniforms gleaming in the sun, their faces weary or expressionless. They marched not toward war, but toward their king, whose delight never faded at the sight of them. To the outside world, it was spectacle. To the soldiers themselves, it was monotony. To history, it is absurdity distilled into its purest form, a regiment of giants that existed only to indulge one man's peculiar obsession. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.